Anytime we watch a piece of footage, whether it's in a movie or on our phones, what we are actually seeing are multiple frames, single individual frames being played back at a very high speed. Similarly, when we capture any video, it's the exact same process. We are capturing individual frames that are being played back at a very high speed. And that allows us to capture all this silky smooth footage that allows us to add dynamic movement to our videos to make things look a shot as if they were to our eyes in real time. But it also allows us as well to slow things down and get much greater detail in the motion and in the movement and in everything that happens around us. And this is all to do with frames per second when we are recording our video. Welcome back to the Professional Diploma in Video Production and Editing. Welcome to lesson number 2. We're going to speak all about frames per second. My name is William Eames. I am your course educator. A big welcome to you if this happens to be your first lesson. I am your educator throughout this course, primarily with a background in photography, but as I mentioned before, I also have extensive background when it comes to video capture as well. Now, if this is your first lesson and you missed lesson number 1, don't worry, you can always review it and go back through it through your student area in shawacademy.com. But let's focus on what's happening in lesson number 2. So as I mentioned there, we're primarily going to be having a look at frames per second, a very important thing to understand when it comes to capturing video, especially if you're coming to video as a photographer. Now you're adding in movement and sound and motion into what you're capturing. Frames per second, very, very key to understand. Resolution, all about the quality of the video that we capture. And aspect ratios, all about the shape of the video that we capture as well. Before we get into all of that, I just want to talk about some of the very basic settings to use to get yourself up and running when it comes to capturing video. As we move on throughout this course, we're going to have a look at taking fully manual control over our exposures and how we record our video. But for now, I just want you to focus on getting some footage that you can use and that you can start to understand and that you can start to play around with. So obviously, the very first thing, if you haven't located it already on your phones or on your cameras, is your record button. Press it to start, it'll start recording, you'll see that little timer go and you'll see it counting away, and you just press it again on most cameras to stop that recording then. It's important that you do play back your video as well. So you go into your playback option. You have a look back at the video that you've captured. You want to make sure that it looks okay. If you've got some headphones plugged in, you want to make sure that it sounds okay as well, because you don't want any nasty surprises when you upload your footage onto your computer later on and you find out that things are maybe out of focus or that the sound is incorrectly recorded or that the exposure is completely wrong. So it's always important to be reviewing your footage as you're going along. You also want to make sure then that you can clearly see your LCD screen as well. So you can also buy these types of attachments that you can see here that will allow you to expand your LCD to make it larger, make it easier to see what you're doing. But these are also quite pricey. So another option is just simply to have some kind of cover or some kind of sunshade for your screen that will block out the sun to allow you to see exactly what's happening on the screen. Because we all know on very, very bright days, it can be very difficult to see exactly what we're looking at. And particularly with video, it's very, very important that you can see exactly what you have captured. Moving on from there, some other settings to be aware of are your zoom and your telephoto. So depending on the type of camera that you're using, or if you're using a phone, you might see these two letters T and W. And what they refer to are wide and telephoto. So wide, pretty self-explanatory. This is going to be your wide shot where you're at the widest angle of view that your lens can capture. Great for landscape photographs, or great for landscape videos, I should say. Or you can then zoom in as well using the telephoto. Now again, this is going to vary dramatically based on what type of camera or phone or device that you are using. If you're using a DSLR, you may have to zoom in manually using the zoom ring on your lenses. Then we have our microphone inputs here as well. So you want to locate where your microphone is positioned on your camera. So you'll usually see this. This is also usually the part where the sound is going to be played back from as well. Sometimes it's on the top of the camera. Sometimes it's on the front of the camera, usually in one of those positions. Similarly with your phone, it's probably going to be at the bottom of the phone where you typically speak into it when you're on a phone call. But you want to locate where your microphone is so that you can always be sure that when you are recording that you're at least pointing in the right direction to get some decent quality sound. Of course, the better option would be to have a microphone input, and on a lot of DSLRs and a lot of cameras, you're going to have these options here to plug in a variety of external devices like our microphone, your audio-visual cable for playing back the footage on a television, and most will now have HDMI cables, which have pretty much replaced our audio-visual cables as well. Some cameras will also have the option for XLR inputs, which is very, very high quality sound, but that's something that we'll speak about at a much later stage. So these are the most basic things that you need to look out for when it comes to shooting video to get yourself set up. Now, what I also recommend at this stage is that you capture your video in auto mode. Now, I know some of you purists out there will absolutely disagree with that, but I just want to remind you that, this course caters for all levels, and I want students to be able to get out there and start recording video and enjoying video straight away. We will be absolutely looking at how to capture video manually, where you're going to be controlling your own shutter speeds, you're going to be controlling your own apertures and ISOs to make creative decisions about how you want your scene to look. But from an exposure perspective, auto mode is a great option to go with because it always aims to make sure that we have the right amount of light in our scenes. So if you want to just get up and running and started with video, not have to worry about whether your video is going to be overexposed or underexposed, stick with the auto mode for now. And that way you can concentrate on developing your eye, developing your movement, and developing your composition. Now, with all of that in mind, let's have a look at our frames per second and let's get started with filming. Now, the idea of frames per second, and indeed the idea of cinema itself, has been around for a very long time. And even back to, ancient China and ancient Greece, there was the idea that, of shadow puppetry and how you could project an image onto a wall using light. But in the 1650s, a magic lantern was developed by a Dutch scientist, Christian Huygens, and basically, as you can see here, this device, you put slides into it, or transparencies with little painted images onto it that were projected onto the wall by a little bit of light, a little bit of fire within the device itself. From the 1820s, these were illuminated by limelight, which I'm sure you've heard the phrase that this person, they're in the limelight, they're famous. And this is all to do with coming from the magic lantern, which again was a prototype of projector. And the person would simply, use the transparency, they'd slide the transparencies through the device here, through the magic lantern, and tell the story using images. And this idea is the exact same idea that we still use today when it comes to frames per second. So this idea of movement to our eyes when it comes to individual frames, when it comes to animation, or when it comes to photography, creating a moving motion image, this is known as the persistence of vision. So, for example, if we have a look at the rocket ship blasting off into space here, all of these animations here, all of these frames would have been done individually, and then they're put together and they're played back in a sequence to create this idea of movement. And it's an optical illusion where multiple images blend together in a single image. The human mind can't differentiate from all of these single images, and it gives this idea of motion to our eyes. Now let's just expand on that a little bit further. So a very simple test to do is to use something what's known as a thaumatrope, which is a scientific toy developed in the Victorian times, which is simply a disc with two different pictures on each of its side. So a very famous example here is a bird in a cage. So a bird on one side and a cage on the other side. And basically, when we combine the two images here, so it's on a string, you tie that string up and you pull it so that the image spins around rapidly, and it makes it look as if the bird is in the cage due to the persistence of vision. So here's a very rapid playback of it, and as you can see here, I mean, this is just a GIF, so it wouldn't be as fast as if it was in real life. But the idea is that the images are moving so fast, they blend together to give us this idea that the bird is in the cage. You can make one of these yourself. They're very, very simple to do. You'll find loads of them online as well. But this idea, during the Victorian times was expanded upon by Edward Muybridge. Edward Muybridge, who was a very, very important figure in both photography and in motion pictures. So he was an English photographer known for his studies when it comes to motion. And indeed, you probably have come across this image before, which is the horse in motion, which was a very, very interesting experiment. All came about because of Leland Stanford of Stanford College fame. And basically he had a rich man's problem where, he had the question as to when a horse was galloping, did all four of its hooves come off the ground? And horses just simply moved too fast for anybody to be able to prove it. So Edward Muybridge stepped in, set up a series of cameras to capture the horse in motion. They were triggered as the horse and the horse rider went by, and captured all of these images, and of course conclusively, as we can see here, indeed in the second, third and fourth frames, indeed all four hooves came off the ground when a horse was in gallop. However, there was another discovery alongside of this, and that was when these images were played back together that we got the horse in motion. So by putting these frames together and playing them back, we got the horse actually galloping. Now, what you can see here in this is that you can still kind of differentiate from the individual frames. So, I don't know exactly what the frame rate is here, but indeed, it's not moving fast enough that it all becomes one single kind of blended animation. We can still kind of see those individual frames, but we still get that idea and that sense of emotion. And this was a huge development when it comes to the history of photography that led then to the invention of motion pictures. So with this idea in mind, this allowed people to be able to start filming things in motion through motion cameras. So images were captured onto film using hand-cranked motion cameras where the light was captured onto film within the camera. And this was what allowed for the invention of cinema and motion cameras. Now, that is absolutely only a very small part of the story. The history of cinema is really complex. There was an awful lot of people involved, like Thomas Edison was also involved when it came to patenting motion pictures and the kinetoscope, and there's the zoetrope as well. Lots of inventions around this time as well that kind of came before cameras were developed to be able to capture motion and movement. So that's a very, very quick overview. But the idea here is that individual frames played back together at a fast rate will give us this perception, this persistence of vision that gives us movement and gives us motion picture. Now, recording is only one part of the story. We also need to play back that footage as well. And that happens through our projectors, which it's basically an inverted camera. As you can see here, it doesn't look completely dissimilar to what we just had a look at with our hand-cranked motion cameras. Basically here we have two film reels that are passed through a light source and are projected onto our screen. This is also controlled by frames per second. Okay, so I'm sure some of you are familiar with frames per second already, especially if you're into your video games and that, you'd be very familiar with like 30 frames per second and 60 frames per second in relation to how something looks and moves on a screen. And it's the same idea. So rather than just simply capturing the footage at a different frames per second, it's played back at different frames per second as well through a projector. Now, of course, everything is digital. So when it comes to recording, everything's recorded onto our digital image sensors, and they record using exposing rapidly to light. This can be up to 120 times per second. So that would be 120 FPS, where it's capturing an image. And you can just think about that, 120 times per second it captures an image. So that's incredibly rapid. And we would use something of that type of frame rate for doing super slow motion playback afterwards. So that is known as the frame rate. And indeed then digital projectors, the same idea. Everything again just digital now at this stage, where the image is projected back again at a very rapid frame rate depending on the frame rate of the film. It's played back through a digital projector where the footage, the little LCD screen actually inside the projector itself, that the light passes through and projects it then onto whatever it is, like, or whether it's a wall or whether it's an actual screen and so on that you're projecting onto. But the concept here, whether it's recording the film or playing back the film, they still operate on different frames per second. So, what are frames per second? What are FPS? FPS, I'm not talking about first-person shooters. Again, if you're a gamer, no, we're talking about frames per second. So it's how many frames are captured each second. So imagine it's a photograph that's being taken over and over and over, and you determine how many times that photograph is taken per each second. So it's also how many frames are projected each second. So again, how many frames are played back each second. Higher frames per second will create a more fluid motion. So higher FPS will make things look a little bit more seamless. There'll be less blur within the footage. Everything will look like it's moving very, very fast. Higher FPS will also allow for slow motion. So as I mentioned, if you're shooting in 120 frames per second or even 60 frames per second, that gives you so many extra frames that you can actually slow that motion down using post-production software so that you can, see everything in much slower detail. And higher FPS, however, can look unnatural. We'll speak about this a little bit more throughout this lesson and indeed throughout this course. But there's at a certain point, it'll get to a stage where, if you're shooting at very high FPS, that it actually doesn't look right to our eyes, that it looks a little bit unnatural. It looks like because there's no blur and kind of no natural motion blur happening, that it looks unusual to us. And frames per second, just to reiterate, it's used in both recording and in playback of our videos as well. So to give an idea of how frame rates look, here we have a simple example. So we've got this line moving across our screen at different frame rates. If we shoot lower than 24 frames per second, you will begin to see the stills and you get that kind of staccato movement as we saw a little bit earlier with the horse in motion. About 16, 15 frames per second is when persistence of vision kicks in, but this is not going to be fast enough for dialogue. So this is also something that we're going to have a look at now in just a second, is that when we're shooting, frames per second, we also have to think about the sound that it accompanies it as well. Now, these are very much just approximations, but it'll give you some type of idea as to the type of different frame rates. As you can see here, the 12.5 frames per second, we can see very much that kind of staccato movement compared to that 50 frames per second, which is a nice kind of smooth line all the way over. Now, higher frames per second gives us a more fluid motion. So as we can see here, again, another example, 15, 30 and 60 frames per second. So again, with our 15 frames per second, we can kind of get that persistence of vision just about. You can still maybe kind of notice a slight staccato movement there. 30 frames per second, which is the standard for television. and for, a huge amount of video and things that we watch on TV. And then you've got 60 frames per second, as you can see, much more fluid. Now, 60 frames per second would be something that if you're into your, say, PC gaming or, some video games as well, they'll play back at 60 frames per second, which is great for something like that. But it's not always the best choice, especially when it comes to cinema or video, is going with the higher frame rates. You're going to want to keep it a little bit lower than that. And the reason for that is to try and make things look a little bit more natural. So setting your frame rate, you will find this in your video settings. Now, this is just taken off I think it's a smartphone. But some of the most common ones here, 24 frames per second, which is our movie and broadcast TV, 25 frames per second if you're PAL, which is the European standard, although 30 frames per second is very quickly becoming the new standard. 48 frames per second. A very famous example of 48 frames per second was The Hobbit by Peter Jackson. And there was a lot of criticism when it came out at the time because it looked unnatural, because people simply were not used to the higher frame rate. People said it looked like a soap opera, and there's definitely merit to that argument. 60 frames per second, very fluid, used for slow motion, used for video games, as I mentioned. And then 120 frames per second would typically be used for super slow motion footage. Now, just before we move on to our next topic, I just want to very briefly talk about 24 frames per second. This was the standard for cinema and indeed for television throughout the 20th century. This is all to do with the soundtrack. So before sound was introduced into movies, the director of photography, whoever was filming the footage, they would either hand crank to capture the footage using the motion camera, or later on there was also mechanized devices used as well. However, because there was no sound, they could actually change the frame rate. So sometimes they'd speed up the frame rate if there was kind of action going on. Maybe they would just kind of slow it down to try and from a budget perspective, preserve the amount of film that they were using. But when sound was introduced, it was actually recorded optically onto the film strip itself as well. So to sync it up with the sound correctly so that it appeared when people were actually speaking, that the words coming out of their mouths matched their lip movement, 24 frames per second was actually the ideal. And this became the standard. But not only that, 24 frames per second very closely matched the kind of movement that we see with the human eye. That's why when we review things on higher frame rates, or indeed if we even see them in super slow motion, things can look a little bit unusual and strange to us because it's not what we're used to seeing. So 24 frames per second, if you're after that natural movement or you want to play it safe, is absolutely the way to go. And we'll certainly be looking at that in greater detail as we move on throughout this course. But let me ask you a very quick question before we segue into our next topic. And I want you to tell me, what was the first movie that you remember seeing in the cinema? The reason that I ask you this is that cinema has such a massive impact on us. It's likely that every one of us can probably remember the first film that we ever saw in the cinema. For myself, I think it was either Home Alone 2 or Beethoven. Certainly was in around that time. I can't remember exactly which one it was, but it was certainly one of either of those two films. And I certainly still remember those films very, very clearly. I just can't remember which one came first. But it's really, really interesting question to try and remember what was the first movie that you saw, or perhaps you can change the question slightly. What was the first movie that you thought had a massive impact on you in the cinema? You can start chat with me through Morpheus. So remember, we've got Morpheus here to answer any questions that you may have, or indeed to answer any of the questions that I pose to you. It's always there. Feel free to type in your responses at any time. We'll try our best to answer your questions as we continue on throughout this course. Now, moving on to our next topic, let's discuss resolution, which is all about the quality, the clarity of your images, of your movies, no matter what the device you happen to be playing back your images or your film on. So resolution, you'd be familiar with this if you have, done any type of photography before. Certainly we discuss it a lot on the photography course. And I've just highlighted some examples here. And as you can see, we've got a lot of highest, options here. You can see the first number here, the one that we have highlighted with the green, is 3,840 by 2,176. What does that mean? Well, basically, that's the pixel by pixel count. So if we multiply those two numbers together, we get an 8.36 megapixel image, which is also known as 4K, which I'm sure you're all familiar with at this stage. So pixels are measured by length by height. So we have the length is the larger number here, and then the height of the image is the smaller number here. We multiply those together to get the total amount of pixels that are in the scene. Aspect ratio, which is the shape of the image, will affect the amount of pixels. Now, you can reduce a high resolution image to a lower resolution image, but it's not possible to do that the other way around. So it's known as downscaling. If I record something in 4K, I can reduce it down to high definition, but I couldn't make a high definition up to 4K. That would be upscaling, and simply the quality, you would begin to see the pixels then, well, unless, depending on the size of the display, but you could potentially see the pixels then when you're increasing a lower image to a higher quality one. Now, just an important note there as well, not all devices are going to allow for a huge amount of changes to things like frames per second or to extensive changes within your aspect ratio and within your pixel count as well. It's all dependent on the type of device that you are using. So, for example, smartphones are going to have more limited options here. Like this is actually from a smartphone screen. Certainly if you're photographing or shooting with a DSLR, you're going to have many more options. But let's just talk about the pixel then. So all of our images, whether it's a photograph, whether it's a digital video or any type of digital image at all, they are made up of pixels. And a pixel is a single block of color. Okay, and it's these coming together of these single blocks of color that will begin to resolve an image to our eyes. Now, a pixel can only ever be a single solid block of color. If you have a look, for example, at the close-up of the eye here, no matter what type of pixel here you try to pick out, I mean, I know these are just various shades of grey to black, but no matter which one you pick out, it is only ever one single tone. And it's these grouping together of pixels which then bring together and resolve the image to our eyes. So, pixels, as I mentioned before, they're basically measured by the length and by the height of your image. And there's some of the most common pixel counts when it comes to video. Our basic HD is 720 pixels. 720, I'm sure you've seen 720p or 720i. And that means we've got 720 pixels going up the height. We've got 1280 pixels going across the top. We multiply those together, and as you can see, we get an image with a resolution of just under 1 million pixels. Just under 1 million pixels. So this is more than enough, really, if you're saying playing back a video on a mobile device. But you might begin to see a slight lack in quality if you're, say, playing this back on a 50-inch television or a 50-inch screen. The next size up then, one we're, again, I'm sure we're very common with, and indeed is the quality that we broadcast these lessons in, is 1080. So resolution 1080, and that's 1080 pixels going up the height, and then 1900 going across the length, which gives us a much higher quality image, which gives us the 2 megapixel image. So that means as well, if you consider the fact that sometimes, we need to take stills from our videos, that taking a quality still, from a 720 HD film is not going to be as good as if we were to take one from a 1080 quality video, so 2 megapixels. But then now we have what's quickly becoming a new standard, which is 4K. And indeed, I know we're going beyond this now, but 4K resolution, as you can see here, a far higher number of pixels within the image, meaning we get much greater clarity in the image. But what it also means is that we get a much higher quality still image as well, 8 megapixels. An 8 megapixel from a still video is huge. It gives us, if you think about it, it gives us 4 more times detail compared to our 1080. So hence the 4K. Okay, so it's 4 times more detail than full HD. And I'm sure if you've ever seen a proper 4K video, you absolutely notice the difference straight away in terms of clarity. And that's really what it is. Clarity, because when we have a larger image, we can see much greater, much finer detail. And this just gives you some type of idea in terms of the scale, as if we were to measure these out physically. So our 1080 pixel is our standard full HD, and we've got a screen that's 4 times the size of that when you're shooting in 4K. So you may be asking yourself then the question, well, should I be shooting in 1080 or should I be shooting in 4K? And, well, the answer is really going to come down to the purpose of your video. Personally, I would still, at this stage, be saying you should be shooting in full HD, unless you've got a specific project that you need to be using 4K quality. A lot of filmmakers will actually shoot in 4K, and as I mentioned, they'll descale the image, they'll bring it down to 1080p because there's an argument there that the quality is actually still better from reducing an image from 4K down to full HD. So that's something a little bit off topic. We'll talk about that at a later stage. But for now, even just in terms of the space on memory, on your memory cards, I think full HD is perfectly acceptable at this stage. Now, just very quickly as well, I'm sure when you've seen, when we speak about 1080, it usually follows with a letter, 1080p or 1080i. What are these all about? Well, this is to do with progressive and interlaced. So first of all, interlaced video is basically when we have 2 sources of video that come together. Interlaced video displays have an even and odd scan lines which come together to create our one image. Now, interlaced video was really something that was used for standard definition for TV, if you're just simply broadcasting through a tube, because it was a lot easier to broadcast, it was a lot faster to broadcast, but now it's becoming used less and less because there's an argument that progressive video is slightly higher quality and gives smoother movement. And progressive video is when we have a progressive scan, it's a single image rather than 2 interlaced images coming together that displays both scan lines. So it's just constantly rolling and constantly capturing a new image. So if you're wondering what the difference is between the 2 of them, really it's at this stage, progressive is the standard, interlaced again, depending on the use of video that you need and where you're going to be broadcasting it, more than likely you're going to be shooting in 1080p. Now, so for our final topic then for this lesson, we'll speak all about aspect ratios, which simply put, aspect ratio is the shape of your photo or your video. It's the relationship between the height and the width of your photo, and it's displayed as ratios. Okay, so as you can see here, we've got a number of different ratios here, like 3:2, 4:3, 1:1, 5:4, and so on. And you will find your aspect ratio where you're setting your resolution as well. The first number is the width, the second number is the height. Just like when we're setting our resolution. The most common ratios are 4:3, which is the old television standard, 16:9, which is widescreen, 3:2, which is, if you're using a DSLR, is your full image on a full frame sensor. And then we've got some more complicated ones like 2.35:1, which is cine ratio, and 1.85:1, which are both widescreen ratios. 2.35:1 is very wide, as we are going to see. The first 3, they can be used for filming as well, of course, but they're typically as well associated with photography. But generally ratios where you begin to see a decimal point like 2.35:1 or 1.85:1. These are cinematic ratios, ones that would be used for broadcasting onto cinema screens. So let's have a look at a few different options here. So 1:1, as you can see, is a square. Okay, so it's 1:1 as the same ratios, the same height, the same width all around. Now, we would rarely ever shoot square videos. The only time that you may ever shoot a square video would be to do, say, something like perhaps an interview or something for Instagram, but very, very rarely would you shoot in this ratio. Expanding it out a bit, we have 4:3 ratio, which was the old standard for televisions before widescreen came in. 4:3 ratio, still used as well. I mean, if you're after that kind of television kind of look, that old retro TV type of look, you would be looking at a 4:3 ratio. As you can see, it gives us a much wider picture. 3:2 is a very common one, particularly for photography. As I mentioned before, if you happen to be shooting on a full frame SLR camera, this is going to give you the full image, 3:2 ratio. So you'll get the entire shot within this type of ratio, a very standard one for filming as well. I think it's a good one for filming too, because it's also possible to, of course, to crop in on the video afterwards if necessary. Next up, we have 16:9, which is a wide screen ratio, as you can see here, very, very wide. And instantly, when we have a very long kind of width here, it really gives it a cinematic quality already, as we can see here. So very long across the top, less in terms of height compared to our previous ratio, and it gives us that cinematic look. We can expand this out even further, and this one here, 1.85:1, a very similar ratio, not a huge way off the widescreen 16:9 ratio as we just saw there, but it just gets a little bit tighter, reduces the height down a little bit more, and as you can see, very much made for very, very wide screens. And then we have an extreme wide shot here, 2:3.5:1 ratio. As you can see here, a cinescope ratio, really, really, really wide. But as you can also see here as well, I mean, fundamentally, the image that we've been using, I mean, we've just been cropping it in more or less compared to that 3:2 ratio. So if in doubt, I would recommend that you shoot in that 3:2 ratio. And it is possible to crop in afterwards as well. But always try to keep in mind exactly what the purpose of the movie is, and what where you're going to be showing it, what device you're going to be showing it on, as this will influence the aspect ratio that you use as well. Now, no matter what aspect ratio that you use, it's very, very important to bear in mind as well your safe zones. Okay, so when we are filming, we need to very much pay attention to the edge of the frame. So if we take a scene like this, for example, anything that's outside of the red square would be lost and would be unsafe for important details. So try to keep your action as close either to the center or away from the edges as possible, without going into that. Try to visualize it, that imaginary red zone, so that you don't lose any important footage. And again, you really, really need to consider the aspect ratio that you're filming in, to consider where that safe zone and that unsafe zone is. And finally, as I mentioned before, think about headroom. We need to make sure our headroom is correct when doing portraits in particular. You don't want to crop off the top of someone's head like this. You want to try and get them nice and centered with a little bit of headroom above them, so they have a little bit of space within the frame to move about as well. You don't want them to be too low either, to the point where it feels or looks like they're kind of sinking out of the frame. So you want to try and find a nice balance when it comes to headroom. And it's all going to be about practicing and visualization. Now, so that is the end of our lesson. Let's just have a quick look at what we learned in terms of our skills. So we're talking about a very technical subject here with our frames per second. So certainly our technical ability has increased, which also allows us to increase our creative vision as well. You can start thinking about the types of frames per second that you want to use to get a certain look and a certain feel to your films. And finally then, you've also increased your communication skills by learning your vocabulary around things like aspect ratios, around frames per second, and indeed around resolution and pixels, being able to communicate very, very clearly exactly to somebody what all these important subjects are. are. Now, if at any stage you need an extra little bit of help when it comes to learning, we also have summary notes as well available to you in your toolkits. You'll find these as an optional purchase within your student login area, along with slides of the lessons as well. And these are a great accompaniment to the course to help you to learn even faster, and also to have something to reference, when it's not possible to attend a lesson. Always have something to go back over, if there's something that you have forgotten about. Now, so let's have a quick look at what's coming up in our next lesson, which is going to be all about lenses and angle of view. So we're going to have a look at how our cameras see and capture the world through our lenses. This is a really fascinating lesson. We'll have a look at how lenses work. We'll have a look at all the different types of lenses that are out there as well, so that you can use the right one for the type of video that you want to capture. Now, of course, we also have a short challenge for you as well. A little bit more of a practical one here for you. I would like, if possible, to record a bouncing ball or running water or something that moves at 2 different frame rates, 2 different frames per second. I want you to see if you can notice any difference in the movement using 2 different frame rates. So try to choose one that's a lower frame rate, if possible, whatever device you happen to be using, and try to choose a faster, higher frame rate, and see if you can notice any visual difference between those 2 clips. If possible, it would be great if you could share those as well with us. #ShawVideo on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Simply use the hashtag #ShawVideo. You can also check out what other students are doing as well by using that hashtag. Simply click on it and it'll bring you to everyone else who's tagged using that. And you'll be able to see work and challenges from all other students who maybe are lessons ahead of you or might be behind you, and see exactly what they're all doing as well. So really, really nice way of getting involved in the community too. So we've run way over time, so we're going to leave it there for this lesson. So thank you so much, and well done on completing lesson number 2 in the diploma in video production and editing. I'll see you all back here again very, very soon for lesson number 3 on module 1.